Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Digital Debate Center. The first thing we're going to talk about today is the rural communities advantage. So that is contention 2 of the Environmental Justice 1AC that you all may remember from last week. So to start off with, let's just go back over the parts of an affirmative case. So first off, you have, of course, your plan. That's the policy action that you're proposing we should do, that you're saying, judge, vote for us to say, do this plan. We have inherency, which describes the state of the world as it is, or the status quo, which is focusing on the fact that there is a problem right now that's not being sufficiently addressed. We have solvency, which explains how the plan solves that problem. And then we have the advantage, also called harms, which is the benefit to doing our plan, which is oftentimes that we avoid doing some harmful thing. So whatever our impact is. You all remember last week, we talked about the environmental justice 1AC. So that the environmental justice advantage was one contention. We're going to talk about the second one today. So just to go back over that real quick, our plan for both advantages is that the United States federal government should fully fund a program to remove harmful pollutants from drinking water. Our inherency argument is that we are currently investing, or Congress has currently passed a plan to invest about $15 billion in water infrastructure, but we really need over $60 billion in order to sufficiently address problems. Our solvency evidence talks about how we need to invest way more than that 15 billion to find and replace lead pipes that are poisoning children, because we really don't know where all these pipes are. We got to invest money in kind of creating maps of the areas and actually finding everything. And then we have our first advantage, or harms, which is about environmental justice, and it makes a moral argument that lead poisoning, because it disproportionately affects children of color and locks people into a cycle of disadvantage, is something that the judge should vote against, kind of vote aft to take a moral stance against what is a fundamentally unjust situation. So now that we've talked a little bit about what the 1AC was from last week, let's go over a couple of concepts that we need to know for the rural communities advantage. So the first is just groundwater. So most of the drinking water in the US generally is from groundwater. So this is what we get through things like wells, which typically we drill into the ground. Sometimes cheaper wells are just dug. This provides about 78% of all of the drinking water in the U.S., and rural communities particularly get most of their water from groundwater. So as you might guess, if you put a bunch of chemicals in the ground, it will get into the groundwater. So nitrates are the other big thing in this advantage, where nitrates are pretty much a compound that is present, naturally in low amounts in our water, but when you have it in high concentrations, it starts to negatively impact your health. So some of the ways that we get high concentrations of nitrates in water are through things like fertilizers from farms, bodily waste. So both if there's insufficient septic sewage systems with just human waste, and with animals on farms, if their waste is just getting into the water, that can contaminate it. And then we also just have general food processing waste. So nitrates, you all might have seen we've had boil water advisories around Georgia sometimes. These are distinct from what happens when they're just boil your water, because you can't just boil nitrates out of the water. You have to chemically treat it through something like reverse osmosis or distillation or ionization. So it's hard to get the nitrates out of the water once it's contaminated. So it's much safer and more effective to just keep the water from getting contaminated in the first place. So there's two pieces of evidence which make up our rural communities advantage. The first is Condon 19. So this card establishes that there is just pretty much a crisis with the amount of contaminated drinking water that we have in rural communities right now. And the reason for this is that the water systems tend to be outdated because they were built a long time ago when the population of an area was much smaller. So it was built maybe to serve, a few hundred people, and now there's almost 1,000 people in that area. So, and because a lot of these systems are very old, lead and copper from the pipes just kind of like dissolves and leaches into the water and contaminates it. And the way it works now is that because water is like a public utility, people generally have to pay for it. So people in these rural communities are literally paying to get contaminated water that, again, even if we said, well, they can just boil it, you can't. And the EPA says that we should be investing about $190 billion into fixing the rural water crisis in this card. So again, remember, in the status quo, we're only investing 15 billion, so not nearly enough. And the EPA specifically says what we're investing now in this is less than half of 1% of what we need. So the second card in this advantage, the Jones and Atkins card, establishes that contaminated drinking water is a public health crisis and that it has fatal consequences, and that millions of rural Americans are at risk. So specifically, it increases your chance of a bunch of health problems. So there's general long-term health things like heart disease or cancer. The higher concentration of nitrates means that people are at increased risk of various types of cancer, ovarian, colon. So agricultural practices, like we mentioned before when we were talking about nitrates, they do things like fertilizer, they have animals producing waste, stuff like that. So because there are a lot of agricultural setups in rural areas, these communities tend to get the brunt of like more nitrates in the water, which means higher risk of cancer and overall more death. So you'll notice here when people ask you about like the units of like nitrates, it's given as 5 parts per million. That might sound really small, but this is far exceeding the level of ppm of nitrates that the EPA says is like safe for human consumption. All right. So the last thing we're going to talk about on this is what the negative might say in response to this advantage. So the 1NC gets 2 cards against this provided in the case. So the first one focuses on what we're already doing now. Specifically, it says that we have federal funding now and that Biden is focusing on modernizing rural water infrastructure. So this card is directly from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it's from mid-late 2020, talking about how they're investing $307 million into finding all of these outdated pipes that are leaching lead and copper into the water and getting rid of them and replacing them. And their predicted, improvement is that about 250,000 residents and businesses will see the benefits of this. And they also claim that, they're specifically focusing on those areas that need it the most. All right. And then our second negative card from Aguilar and Willingham in 2020 is that rural development programs can't solve because of systemic issues. So this card is essentially making the overall argument that the AF is trying to like plug one hole in a canoe that's like full of holes and there's more holes coming in. And instead of looking at why is this canoe full of holes, it's just like, let's just plug this one and we'll be good. So the federal office that deals with rural communities is just called the Rural Development Office at the USDA. And they would be the ones who would be implementing this plan. And part of what they do is that they give competitive loans to rural communities now, and this encourages kind of fighting between the rural communities. And these loans aren't to do, massive things like fix the infrastructure problems that cause the drinking water to be poisoned. It's more like, okay, you can get what you immediately need to survive. Like you can get enough drinking water that you'll be okay for another day. But none of these programs that the Rural Development Office oversees actually do anything to address the root cause of what's wrong with the water problems. The loans in general, don't encourage larger investment of the scale that the plan calls for. So generally, the negative is just saying that this is like putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound. Like it's just too little to deal with this big problem that's got a completely separate cause. All right, so the second thing we're going to be talking about today is the federalism disadvantage. So to start off, we're just going to quickly go over the structure of a disadvantage. as a recap. So there's 4 parts we're going to talk about. The first is uniqueness. So uniqueness, kind of like inherency, describes the status quo, but instead of saying, oh, there's a problem in the status quo right now that's not being addressed, we say things are kind of okay now, but they're not like perfect. And if we shake things up too much, things will not be okay anymore. So you can think of this as kind of like something is on the brink like right now, like perhaps the economy is on the brink right now, or some market is on the brink right now, where it hasn't been pushed over yet, but if something changes, it could fall over the brink. Next, we have the link, which describes the change that the plan makes to the status quo. So this is the shakeup that pushes us over the brink. And the argument of the disadvantage is that, or the story of the disadvantage is that this change will ultimately lead to our impact. So the internal link kind of gives us additional explanation of how exactly we get from the status quo to the impact based on the change the plan made. So it's kind of just like, instead of just saying, okay, A is the status quo and F is the impact, the internal link is kind of like, okay, here's B, C, D, E to get us there. And finally, we have the impact, which is just that bad thing that ultimately happens because the plan changed the status quo. So this is your big consequence that you're going to be telling the judge as the negative, like, this is what you're preventing if you vote neg. Like, if you do the plan, this is what you're dooming all of us to. So before we jump into the specific evidence, let's just go over a couple of concepts that are useful for understanding this disadvantage. So this, as you might have guessed, is all about federalism. So federalism describes how we have not just, one big central government, but we have a combination of the federal government and our smaller, state and local governments. So instead of just saying, the federal government makes all the decrees and we all just follow them, the state and local governments also have power to do things in their territory. And in a world where federalism is resilient and working effectively, these governments aren't like competing with each other or like contradicting each other. And then the second big concept is just federal grants. So grants are just money that is provided by the government, in this case, the federal government, to achieve a specific goal. So a lot of times this is used as an incentive for something, and this part is kind of important to understanding the link. So say the federal government really wants states to do something, they really want them to like focus on one issue or like start programs to deal with it. They might say, oh, we're giving out grants for these kinds of programs. So the only way you can get it is to do what they want. So federal grants are just a fancy way of saying money from the government. But the reason we care about them is because states tend to be willing to do things in order to get that money. So the first card we have is our uniqueness evidence, but it also functions as a link. So when you're deciding later on in the debate what you want to extend, remember that this is uniqueness and link evidence. But pretty much, so our description of the status quo is that the federal government and the state governments are working together on water infrastructure right now. So, the federal government's not doing anything unilaterally. There's nothing like the plan happening right now. And the argument for the link is specifically that action by the federal government alone is bad for federalism, because they should be doing things kind of in conjunction with the states. So our specific link card says that federal grants are bad for federalism. The argument is that, or the first thing it establishes is that state and local governments right now mostly rely on their own money. Only about a fifth of their revenue is from federal grants, but for the most part, they're pretty independent when it comes to financial resources. So if we create a world through federal grants where state and local governments are relying mostly on the federal government for their budgets and their resources, that would hamper their ability to act independently, because instead of just doing whatever they were going to do, they're going to be doing whatever's going to get them grants. So the argument is that pretty much things are good right now, but if grants become too big of a thing, then states are going to start just doing whatever the federal government wants, and that's bad for federalism. Our internal link evidence connects federalism to climate change. So federalism is important for solving climate change because the states have taken such a big lead on climate action during the Trump administration. Because we pulled out of the Paris Agreement and the federal government wasn't taking a lot of action, the states stepped up and they were leaders on climate action. The U.S. Climate Alliance has over 25 states and represents over half of the U.S. population, and it really took a leadership role in a way that didn't involve the federal government at all. So this card argues that instead of doing unilateral action on climate change, what Biden should do is work with the states based on the steps they've already taken over the past 4 years in order to, adequately solve things. So our impact is that global warming causes extinction. So this happens by making a bunch of independent things more likely. So there's collapse of the ecosystem, which is probably the thing that you all hear the most when people talk about the catastrophic impact of global warming. The planet would become uninhabitable. Things like, farming would be unsustainable. So it's like, well, we have no food. We can't grow anything. There's no safe water to drink. And then it also makes violent conflicts more likely in various ways. So it generally leads to, civil unrest, political tensions, economic instability, and all of these things increase the risk of things like nuclear war or nuclear terrorism. So the argument is that things will generally become unstable and we will become more likely to engage in conflicts with, other states in a world where climate change gets substantially worse. So what could the affirmative say in response to the federalism DA? Well, the evidence has a 2AC block ready with 3 key arguments. So the first of those arguments is a no internal link argument, which says that it really doesn't matter who deals with climate change as long as we're dealing with it. So even if the states don't get to be leaders and Biden doesn't work with them and he's just like, I'm doing what I want to do, that will be okay because he's already doing enough to help us meet the benchmarks we need to avoid the worst effects of global warming. So the second argument has 2 pieces of evidence. The overall argument is that federalism is very strong and the plan wouldn't be enough to really take out federalism. So the first argument is just that the negative link is wrong, essentially, that instead of federal grants killing federalism, you can just do it and still have states do what they do. So federal action doesn't automatically kill state autonomy and vice versa. Federalism, as a system, this card talks about, is based on having national consensus. It already has systems baked into it to allow for disagreement. So it's not like the federal government says my way or the highway on funding. And the way our government is set up, we have a lot of different kind of institutions that create laws. It's not just hierarchy or one where you just have the federal government and everyone else is just well, we can't do anything. So even in a world where there's disagreement and this doesn't line up with what the states want to be doing, and they're all they're not all going to be dependent on what the federal government does for all of their money, and they're still going to be able to do what they want to do. The second argument, the second card in support of the argument that federalism is resilient, is using the pandemic as evidence that you can have a bunch of disagreement between the state and federal government and things still work. So if you all have probably seen this, there is not one uniform way that the federal government said, we're going to do this, and then every single state and every local area did it. What really happened is the federal government has said some things, and then all the different states have gone off and said their own things. And even within states, like we've seen with Atlanta and within school districts, people are still having their own individual mandates. So pretty much everything that we've seen with the pandemic and differing responses to it are proof that federalism is strong and that everyone is that, and that states will still have their autonomy even if they're not actively going along with what the federal government wants. All right, and then the last argument in the 2AC block against the federalism dissed is that climate change will not kill all of us because of adaptation. So this is a no impact argument. The argument is that even though people have made projections about the absolute worst effects of climate change, where the planet is unlivable and there's no way that humanity can ever survive, is that we're not going to see that big of an extent probably. What we're actually going to see as effects of climate change are going to be things that, will be not good, but not going to kill off the human race. And that these effects that we will see happen, slowly over time, and that we'll have time to adapt to them. Not that it'll be we're here today, we're gone tomorrow. And then the last key warn in this card is that humanity will take action when the effects get bad enough, way before we hit a point where the earth is like uninhabitable and we're seeing wars and all that. So this card pretty much just argues that the Torres evidence is like overhyped, that there's no way things get that bad or that things will get that bad that quickly, and that we have time to actually like deal with things before we get there. So that is the federalism dissad and the affirmative response to federalism.